So, dann begrüße ich alle ganz herzlich und am meisten und ganz wunderbar, dass Sie hier sind. Sarah Thornton, very warm welcome. We're very happy that you could make it to include in your Europe tour this evening in Düsseldorf, and I'm very happy that you all came here. And yeah, we just spoke about the books of Sarah Thornton. Maybe you know, oder ich spreche mal zuerst ein bisschen auf Deutsch und dann wird es schön auf Englisch weitergehen. Also es gibt dieses Buch 7 Tage in der Kunstwelt. Das ist von 2008, glaube ich, und ich weiß nicht, ob wer das von Ihnen gelesen hat. Wir haben gerade von Sarah Thornton gehört, dass es in unglaublich viele Sprachen übersetzt wurde, also ein richtig globaler Bestseller eigentlich geworden ist. Und jetzt ist das neue Buch rausgekommen, 33 Artists, 33 Künstler in 3 Akten. Das ist jetzt gerade auf Deutsch auch erschienen. Hier auf der rechten Seite sehen wir das Cover vom englischen Paperback. Und ja, also Sarah Thornton, um sie kurz vorzustellen, ist jemand, die schon aus der Kunstgeschichte kommend, aber auch aus der Soziologie auf eine sehr eigene Art und Weise an die Kunst drangeht und sehr die Künstler, jetzt zum Beispiel in dem neuen Buch, fast wie eine Soziologin untersucht, wie eine Ethnologin, die die Künstler als eine ganz eigene Spezies und ja, Gruppe von Menschen irgendwie sieht und denen Fragen stellt, wie was für eine Art Künstler sind sie eigentlich, und wo es auch geht um Geld, um Politik, um die Produktion von Kunst. Das sind diese 3 Akte, die es in diesem neuen Buch zu beschreiben geht. Insofern bin ich sehr, sehr froh, dass wir ihr mit Sarah Thornton eine echte Bestseller-Autorin im Bereich der zeitgenössischen Kunst. Es gibt es ganz schön selten eigentlich, muss man sagen, dass da jemand Bücher schreibt, die das so nahe bringen, die so verständlich sind für viele, dass das und die dabei trotzdem klug sind und wirklich auf eine intelligenten Weise die Geschichte der zeitgenössischen Kunst und ihrer ihrer Entstehungsbedingungen darstellen kann. Heute Abend, und da möchte ich auch gerne Heinz-Norbert Jocks sehr herzlich begrüßen, der Sarah Thornton vorgeschlagen hat als seinen Gast, weil sie beide selber eine interessante Konversation begonnen haben über dieses Thema, was wir, und deswegen geht es jetzt von den Büchern eigentlich auch ein bisschen weg, was wir hier am Haus jetzt sehr auch kritisch und durchaus auch bewusst darüber, dass der Begriff an sich schon schwierig ist, Globalisierung, darüber zu sprechen. Und ja, ich bin sehr froh, dass das heute geklappt hat, und I hope you could understand a little bit what I said, maybe not, but it was, yeah, I think, thank you. Thank you very much for coming, and now I get the microphone.
Thank you very much.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your coming from Berlin, and tomorrow you will go to Paris. And you have a nice step, I hope, here in Düsseldorf. And never we have seen each other in real life. So it's a kind of experiment. I don't know in which way you will react on my questions. And so we will see what happens. So this talk will be a kind of experiment. And perhaps I start in a way how I came to the idea to make this talk to you about globalization. Of course, I read your books and I like them very much. And because you are traveling a lot, I was thinking about, and you're writing in a way about it, but you go to San Francisco, to London, to China, and so my question was, in which way you are thinking about what happens in the world? What happens, in which way we have to think perhaps about globalization. And another subject could be cultural differences. Mm-hmm. But because it's a very difficult subject, I want to start in a very slowly way.
Thank you.
And for me it's important too. And I want to talk about your way of writing first. Because what I realize is what you have a kind of narration. If you speak about the artist, you have written the last book about 33 what is the name of, what is the title of it?
33 artists and 3 acts.
Thank you very much. So, and you're writing about it in a way that you give a description of the clothes of the people, but you give a description of the spaces. And my feeling is, but because of this kind of writing, you have a feeling that you are in the center of everything, and you want to give this impression. But let us talk a little bit about your way. How did you find this way of narration?
Well, I think I came at it from 2 different perspectives. As an undergraduate, I actually studied art history with a minor in cinema. And I think that my understanding of narrative comes from watching films. I mean, I've always been a big reader, but I've tended to read nonfiction rather than necessarily narrative fiction. So I do feel like, picturing things and describing things in a way that people can see them creates a kind of experience that is easier to remember than a kind of abstract argument or an abstract conversation where you just have these disembodied voices talking back and forth at each other. So being a cinema buff and studying cinema a tiny bit as an undergraduate, but then when I did my PhD, I trained to be an ethnographer. And ethnography is very much about cultural detail and empirical detail. It's a method of research based on 2 forms of research, participant observation and interviewing. And I remember my PhD supervisor saying to me, a good ethnographer has a novelist's eye for detail. And so when I go into a studio situation or I'm watching an artist install or I'm doing research of any kind, I tend to take loads and loads of pictures of absolutely everything, including the things that you wouldn't normally take pictures of, like feet and shoes and the ceiling and the lights and light switches, everything, because I'm never, and bookshelves, and because I'm never quite sure what I'll need when I'm writing. And I tape record the interview, and I also take notes. And one of the things I take notes of are people's nonverbal behavior. Because people's nonverbal behavior will often tell you what they feel about what they're saying and how much they believe what they're saying. And in the art world, there are a lot of conventions around what is the expected thing to say and the correct thing to say and the credible thing to say, which may or may not be 100% honest. And so those are a few ways I came to that narrative style, I guess. I mean, I also think that the art world doesn't read as much as it pretends it does. And so writing in a very engaging and entertaining way is a good way of being read more often. And I wrote my PhD on dance clubs and raves, and it came out as a book called Club Cultures, Music, Media, and Subcultural Capital. But it was fairly readable, and it became like this oxymoron of an academic bestseller, at least in Britain, and was very popular amongst undergraduates. And I think it kind of gave me an appetite for being read. And so with both 7 Days in the Art World and 33 Artists and 3 Acts, I was concerned to be read and also to make an exclusive world and an excluding world as accessible as possible. Yeah.
You gave the answer for the second question, because I was thinking about, because I'm writing a little bit too, and in which way you memorize the spaces, because you give a very clear feeling for the space. And but I want to make the question a little bit deeper. Why it's important for you to give an impression of the spaces, of the clothes, of the surface too? What does it mean for the portrait? And another question I want to ask you, if you are meeting people from the art scene, you have always the problem that every artist, included either way, or Maurizio Catalano, they give a kind of autofiction, but you are looking for the truth. How is it possible to find the truth about a person whom you meet perhaps twice times?
Well, okay, so those are two completely different questions. I think I'll tackle the second one first because it's fresher. I mean, one of the things I explore in 33 Artists and 3 Acts are myths and different myths of being an artist. And I'm very interested in the myths that artists tell themselves, the kind of stories artists tell themselves when they're in the studio about what they're doing. And you know, some myths are moribund and appear to be bankrupt, and nobody believes in them anymore, and that can make it difficult for artists to command belief in their work. Other myths seem to be alive and fresh and resonant. And, you know, in my opinion, art needs its myths. I mean, it's part of the way that these inanimate objects become imbued with greater meaning. They pull in, like, the myths that are still salient in various cultures. It's very hard to determine if somebody's telling the truth, but I think if you're very attentive to what they're saying and really observe their nonverbal behavior too, you can have an indication in how much they believe in what they're saying. And so Ai Weiwei speaks with tremendous conviction. So he's very persuasive as a result, at least my experience of him. And I got the feeling that he was tremendously honest when he was speaking to me for whatever reason. You know, when I asked him what is an artist, he didn't have an immediate answer, because it's not the kind of question you get asked every day, and even him, who gets interviewed about 3 times a day. And he told a very elaborate story of his father, who had been exiled and was the enemy of various governments, the Chiang Kai-shek government and then the Mao government. And talked about this, you know, throughout his childhood, his father had been an enemy of the state. So at the end of this long anecdote, I say, so does that mean an artist is an enemy of the state? And he said, an artist is an enemy of general sensibilities. And so that definition of an artist is a kind of romantic, avant-garde definition, which is hard to hold on to, let's say, if you live in Düsseldorf or New York. Because where's the general sensibility? I mean, we have freedom of speech here, you know, barring hate speech in a certain, you know, fringe areas, you can kind of say what you like, and it's hard to identify what the general sensibility is because we live in pluralist cultures and even factionalized governments that are overtly factionalized. But for an artist who lives in a country without freedom of speech and with limited human rights, that avant-garde definition of the artist makes sense still. And I think he can credibly inhabit it. So I don't tend to use the word truth because I don't know how to access it, but I do talk a lot about belief and other people's belief and faith. Because I think most artists demand a kind of leap of faith nowadays, for you to believe in them and believe in their work. And now, I think you need to ask me the first question again. Why do I talk about people's clothes and spaces? And I mean, that is partly an ethnographer's eye for detail, but it also comes from studying Pierre Bourdieu and looking at all of those small cultural details as indicators of people's position in the social structure and attitude to their position in the social structure, because we make conscious and unconscious choices every day about how to present ourselves, and some of which we can control and some of which we can't, especially when it comes to spaces and square footage and parts of town and that kind of thing. So really paying attention to those things is paying attention to the sociological for me. and they all kind of reveal aspects of class and ethnicity and gender and attitudes to them as well.
In order to come a little bit more close to the subject, you are born in Canada, but you studied in London. You are living now in Los Angeles. You are
San Francisco.
Excuse me.
That's okay.
You lived for a
Don't
while
worry.
in Los Angeles too.
California.
And now you're writing. My feeling is the fact that you are traveling has to do with your research, of course, but it has to do with yourself too.
Mm-hmm.
And about it, I would like to know more. My feeling is everything what you are speaking about it in a way, but you have the feeling you are in the middle of a scene, but at the same time you have a feeling you are outside of a scene, but at the same time you can realize, if you can read a little bit between the lines, what you are speaking about yourself, if you are speaking to people.
Mm-hmm. I grew up in Canada. My mother was British, and we moved around a lot. So I was often the new girl in school, and my father was Canadian. And I think I often felt like I was never in the group. And I think my mother has always held on to having a very strong sense of alienation, actually. My best friend from high school, who is still my best friend, who I talk to twice a week, was German and grew up in a very like a classic immigrant German family where they never spoke English in the house ever, and they always observed everything in kind of an almost more German way than the Germans would, because they had kept to the traditions of 1958 or whenever they'd happened to leave, you know. And so I think that I always had a little bit of a suspicion of the local and felt like I was an international person somehow. And it felt natural for me to leave to study in Britain. And I initially lived in Scotland, and then I lived in London, and then I did live in Los Angeles for a time and in Berkeley, California, and then went back to London. I think that it contributed to the attraction of ethnography for me, because ethnography is very much about the study of otherness. It comes out of an anthropological tradition, and one of its abiding principles is that one shouldn't pass judgment, which really is a very important principle when, let's say, you know, you're a British anthropologist and you're going to Papua New Guinea or Kenya to study a tribe. It's exceedingly important not to pass judgment on their primitiveness or anything that that what had previously been done. And so I feel like that's, of course I do pass judgment, and I do have my own taste and my own values and that kind of thing, but I feel like I can be a much more productive researcher and a better investigative journalist if I hold on to those principles. So I often get asked nowadays, are you an insider or an outsider to the art world? And when I started writing 7 Days in the Art World, I was very much an outsider, actually, because despite having studied art history, and I'd actually worked in an art gallery as an undergraduate, I'd left it for a long time. When I slid down the cultural hierarchy, worked on popular culture, taught at Sussex University. I was really not involved in the art world at all, and except for a couple of girlfriends who'd gone on to be curators, I had no affiliations. But in the course of researching 7 Days in the Art World and also writing journalism, I increasingly moved inside. And so when I started 33 Artists and 3 Acts, I think it's safe to say that I was an insider of sorts, and that helped me gain access to the artists in the book. But I think I still hold on to this sense of self that I'm an outsider. And I think actually one of the wonderful things about, particularly artists who've been in their studio for some time, and there are really no emergent young artists in 33 Artists and 3 Acts. I decided to stick with artists who had at least 20 years experience of being an artist, partly because they answered the questions I was asking in a kind of deeper and more idiosyncratic way. And I was very self-conscious of the very big generational differences, having done my PhD on youth culture. And so when you go into an artist studio and they, they're kind of got set in their ways and comfortable in their space, it can feel like a kind of anthropological experience. It can have that sense of otherness where they've kind of created their own universe. That I particularly like that when that happens.
Being an outsider, and becoming an insider, this kind of switching in between, in which way it doesn't help to have another kind of look on the art scene?
Tell me that again. I didn't quite catch that one.
Being an outsider,
yeah,
of the art scene, and becoming an insider.
Yep.
This kind of switching between being an insider and becoming an outsider, in which way it helps to have another understanding of the art scene, of artists?
Well, I mean, I am interested in teasing out the things that are often unarticulated. And having one foot on the outside helps you do that. There are a lot of assumptions about credibility and authenticity and validation and legitimation and that cluster of things that any player in the art world or participant in any shape or form is going to have an instinctive understanding of, but it actually can be very hard to articulate it and pinpoint it because it is informing all of one's decisions, but at a subconscious level. And so having a foot on the outside can help you see what is so obvious to others in a way, but unarticulated. And the other way, I guess, that I maintain a kind of outsider position is writing for The Economist, which is, a magazine for well-educated people, but not people with any great knowledge of art, and actually, to a large extent, not a large extent, but to some extent, an antipathy towards contemporary art. And I only really realized that when I wrote a piece about Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, because I discovered that Arturo Schwartz, who'd written his catalog Raisonné, was trying to sell another edition, like another urinal, which was outside the edition, and Christie's had actually kind of hadn't printed them up, but had started, had looked like they were about to put it up on the auction block, and what happened was I wrote about it and they took it out. But what I realized was the blog, when the article went online, there were all sorts of comments that made it clear that they didn't even think that his pissoir was a work of art. So that having the discipline, I don't actually write for The Economist all that much anymore, but I did often during the period I was researching 33 Artists and 3 Acts, and having the discipline of trying to explain things to people who don't understand our world can be a good way of seeing what makes it so peculiar and appealing.
Now you have written a lot about subculture too, and in your new book, where I have forgotten the name of him, you met him, where you have spoken or where you have written about subculture too.
Howard Becker? No, sorry. I met him?
In the book. You have written
in 33 Artists and 3 Acts?
Reading closest to. It's not important.
Okay, Mike, I'm not certain. A sociologist?
No, an artist.
An artist.
This is
Grayson?
not my question.
Grayson Perry? Okay.
Forget it.
So,
Later.
don't worry.
Why you are interested in subculture, and what kind of difference you can realize between normal culture and subculture?
Well, I'm sure it has to do with the fact that I was a lesbian undergraduate, and was hugely involved in gay subculture as an undergraduate, and then came in and have come out again. So I've gone back and forth, and so I think that made me kind of acutely aware. If you're only living and existing in a subculture, you're not so aware of the way it functions. It just becomes natural to you. But when you move in and out of subcultures and between subcultures, their mechanics become more apparent. And I think too, I don't think I'm that socially adept. And I always joke that I became a sociologist because the only way I could kind of understand things was if I studied them.
But perhaps let us speak a little bit more about it. Do you see a difference between artists coming from the subculture, and Andy Warhol was a subculture artist, and artists?
Sorry, Andy Warhol.
Yeah,
Andy Warhol.
Where is a difference for you of consciousness of making, in which way someone is making art?
That's a really interesting question. Well, yes. I think a lot of the pop artists evolved out of subcultures and used the popular culture from their subcultures in their work. That is a very difficult question for me to ask I'm starting, because you've mentioned Warhol, I'm starting to think about it historically, but because I'm not technically an art historian, I don't know if I really can answer it that way. Maybe if I put it in the present tense and think about the artists in here, I don't know. I kind of feel like there are certain cultures that are, It depends on from country to country, perhaps, because class can be heavily involved in the recruitment of artists. And so historically, a lot of British artists have come from the working class, and that's partly because the middle classes didn't go to art school in the same way that the working classes did. In the U.S., being an artist especially because art education has been included within the university system, so you can take studio art at Yale and Harvard and UCLA. It has the whole movement through relationship between art and class is different. What I found in the Middle East is that the artists tend to come from the upper classes. Partly because the lower classes have actually, art is not on their horizon whatsoever. And of course, in the Middle East, that is the place where you're least likely, you have the lowest rates of literacy outside of Africa. So I don't have a quick and easy answer for that very interesting question. I think because, if one was to think about it in terms of gay subculture more specifically, it might be easier because it's quite hard to, you can say hippie culture was a very instrumental part of the art world for many years. But I can't offer you a big general macro perspective on that, I don't think.
You have written your new book about what's the name of a couple? Danish Pavillon, Elmgreen.
Elmgreen and Dragset, yes. Michael Elmgreen and Inger Dragset, who are an artistic duo.
And you have written about their work in Venice, the house, the two houses of collectors.
Yes.
And this piece is speaking about it, exactly. Perhaps we can take this example in order to make it more deep.
That's interesting. The book is divided into 3 parts. Act 1 is politics, Act 2 is kinship, Act 3 is craft. And Act 2, kinship, opens with Elmgreen and Dragset in summer 2009 installing their Danish and Norwegian pavilions. So it was very unusual. No one artist, because technically they call themselves each half an artist, had ever had 2 pavilions. And here they were awarded 2 pavilions right next to each other because Michael is Danish and Inger is Norwegian. And it was the recession, really deep in the throes of the financial crisis. And they decided to treat the Giardini as if it were a neighborhood in which the houses were up for sale. And so they transformed the Danish pavilion into a family home of a dysfunctional family that were getting a divorce and in which the teenager was kind of like this dark goth. That was the implication based on the artworks and the installations in the house. And then the Nordic pavilion was a gay bachelor pad full of homoerotic art. And so, there they, I guess, were contrasting what you call they had a subcultural home and a bourgeois, mainstream cultural home, which actually within it contained subculture insofar as the teenage daughter, was a brooding goth. By implication, I think it was a work by Clara Lydon. With Elmgreen and Dragset, they are very sociologically minded and they're very interested in class and sexuality and gender. Those are key themes for them. And certainly gay subcultural life is a repeated theme in their work. At the Istanbul Biennial, they showed their collection of photographs of gay men from all walks of life, which they see as their extended family. Yes.
And what I found very interesting, because the house, the apartment or the bungalow of a rich gay collector who was swimming like a dove in the swimming pool outside of the pavilion.
Yes.
And inside there was naked men.
Yes.
Like prostitutes.
Yeah.
And so if you enter the space, you have the feeling to be a voyeur.
Uh-huh.
And it has to do, I think, with subculture background of the 2 artists.
Absolutely. It was an intensely subcultural experience. It was like, there was gay porn. One of the works I remember fairly vividly, I think it was by Terence Coe, was a miniature replica of Michelangelo's David, and all the anatomy was absolutely accurate except for the penis, which was greatly enlarged. Because it is amazing if you look at the original how small it is. It clearly, ideals have changed. It was a kind of very intensely gay male pavilion, which created a strong sense of voyeurism. Most definitely.
Perhaps in order to give an idea why I asked
Please,
these questions.
yeah.
Because for me, the same question, subculture and normal culture, there's a difference. And I think this art piece of them may give an idea of it. And but we can come back to this point again. Now, your book is, and both books are speaking about your traveling, like switching between continent and another continent, country, language, and all these things. But you have a feeling if you read it, only one chapter gives another impression, where you're speaking about an African artist in New York who is speaking about his black culture.
Hers.
Yeah.
Wengeshi Mutu.
Yes, exactly. And for me, you have a feeling switching between continents, China, America, and so on, or South America. You have a feeling there's no difference. Only in the chapter where you're writing about the black African artist in New York, because he's speaking about it by himself. And for me, the question is, for you, this kind of cultural difference exists, or they are disappeared?
I see, especially Act 1 politics, which is the act in which you'll find Wengeshi Mutu and Kutlu Gadaman and Eugenio Dittborn and Gabriel Orozco and Ai Weiwei and Jeff Koons and Martha Rosler. And in each act, there's an artist who teaches, and in that act is Tammy Ray Carland, who teaches at the California College of the Arts out in San Francisco. I see massive cultural differences between them, and I feel like it's one of the themes of that act. So that, one of the reasons I was keen to include Eugenio Dittborn is because he came of age during the reign of Pinochet, and it's interesting to contrast him with someone like Ai Weiwei, who's living through a kind of dictatorship of the people, whereas Eugenio lived through a right-wing dictatorship. And their strategies for survival in those, or for self-destruction in those two environments are so dramatically opposed. And Eugenio Dittborn kind of basically created a studio that is literally underground, it's a basement, and created these paintings that you could put in an envelope and mail out of the country because it was his way of exhibiting. And, there were many artists amongst the disappeared in the 70s, and there was no freedom of speech. And one of the things that was kind of most traumatic for Dittborn was that not only did artist friends disappear, but his psychotherapist disappeared. And this came to kind of haunt his work in a way that he didn't realize for a whole decade. So these people are all participating. They're aware of each other, and they're participating in an international art world, but I feel like there's still kind of like a fair amount of specificity related to their nation and their city. And, someone like Orozco, I think, for example, the way politics gets played out in different art worlds is very different. And so I think probably American artists are more apolitical than Mexican artists or German artists, depending where they're located. And there's a quote here, and I don't know if I can pick it out, from Orozco, where he talks about like the different expectations of different national cultures on the role of the artist. And hold on, I think I can find it. Sorry, it's here. Yeah, because he is very resistant to the pressure to be what he calls an opinionator, because in Mexican culture, partly because the whole history of Diego Rivera and the surrealists was their and the muralists was their involvement with the Communist Party and their involvement in politics. And so there's like the whole legacy of Mexican art history puts pressure on contemporary artists to speak politically, either overtly or covertly in their work. And so, and also Orozco's father had been an artist and an outspoken left-wing artist, as he puts it. But, so Orozco tells me he doesn't want to be a, quote, political professional who opinionates about everything. And he says he's encountered this pigeonhole when traveling to certain countries on the biennial circuit where, quote, people expect the artist to be a kind of missionary or doctor that comes to a country armed with good ideas, recipes, solutions, social goodness. You become a kind of artiste sans frontières, you know, like, I don't know what that would be in German, but, you know, médecins sans frontières, doctors without borders. You know, he says, you know, in America, Britain, and other market-driven art worlds, artists are not expected to be politically engaged, and if they are likely to be ignored. He says, quote, that was me talking, now him, the role of the outspoken activist is occupied by celebrities like Angelina Jolie, says, you know, Orozco. She does the job that in France would be filled by Jacques Derrida or in Mexico by Frida Kahlo. So I think there's a lot of running commentary about the differences. But I'm sorry you didn't notice it.
No. I was saying in the beginning it's a kind of experiment what we are doing. So
right.
It's an experiment. But in the beginning you have said what you like details.
Uh-huh.
And where are some details who are speaking about cultural differences when you are visiting, for example, Chinese artists and American artists?
Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak about it?
Yeah, I mean, the two Chinese artists in the book are Ai Weiwei and Zheng Fanzi, who are kind of complete opposites. And so Zheng Fanzi...
I think it's better to speak
without reading. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. It's hard to follow at speed. So let's see. I mean, I think there are many artists in China who espouse a kind of pre-Duchampian version of art. And if they don't, then sometimes they officially do. So someone like Zheng Fanzi talks about craftsmanship as a kind of, you know, being an honest do-it-yourself painter is like being a good peasant, and being a kind of post-Duchampian assembler of ready-mades who oversees a studio is like being a grand entrepreneur. And that strikes me as like a very specific analogy, which makes sense if you grew up in a communist country, and doesn't really make sense if you grew up in America or West Germany. One of the reasons why I opted with Ai Weiwei, it seemed to me, had to be in the book, and there were various artists I felt had to be in the book, partly because when you went into an artist's studio and asked them, like, what is an artist, people like Jeff Koons and Ai Weiwei and Damien Hirst came up spontaneously in conversation, usually as something against which the artist would distance themselves. And so from early on, it was clear to me that they had to be in the book. So Ai Weiwei I knew I wanted to have in the book, but it was unclear to me who the other Chinese artists should be. And I went with Zheng Fanzi not because he's my favorite Chinese artist, but because he really offered something that was diametrically opposed, and his studio was right round the corner, and they were the same generation, and it made for a kind of clearer comparison. And you know, here is an artist who's very circumspect. You know, not going to say something that will run him afoul of the communist regime, is willing to subjugate any political issues toward the greater good of his market, which is something he shares with Koons, and he's kind of like the Koons of China in a way. You know, offers a great contrast to Ai Weiwei, who, you know, may very well sell his work for high prices, but it is not the guiding force of the way he behaves, and certainly not the guiding force of his work. So, and because I was interested in comparing and contrasting artists, and because the recurring characters in Act 1 are Ai Weiwei and Jeff Koons, I included Xing Fanzi as a contrast to them both in a way.
But do you think I met Ai Weiwei several times too.
Yeah.
And he's, for example, one detail for me. If you are going to China, visit some Chinese artist, the first thing what you are doing is drinking tea.
Could you say that again?
The first thing what you
Yeah,
are doing
yeah.
if you are in the studio of a Chinese
Of course.
artist, only Ai Weiwei. He normally he didn't give you a tea, but normally it starts with drinking tea,
Yeah.
and you start the conversation very slowly. And this is for me a culture difference too. But
Mhm.
is it possible to compare what Ai Weiwei is doing to with someone who is an artist, a political artist too?
Well, let me think. I mean, there are opportunities to compare Martha Rosler with Ai Weiwei. I think one thing they both share is they're not afraid to be didactic, and that is something that's usually frowned upon in the art world, even amongst political artists. They'll say they don't want to be didactic. They don't want to, be overly instructive. I think that both Rosler and Ai Weiwei subjugate aesthetics to politics and will prioritize politics in many instances. Much of there are many different strands to Rosler's work, but human rights issues around women were a key factor in her early work with videos like, I'm just going to remember, it's a long title, it's a great piece, Statistics of a Citizen, Vital Statistics of a Citizen Simply Obtained, where she's stripped naked and these doctors measure her all over. It bears similarities to work in which Ai Weiwei appears naked, actually, if you were going to look for, affiliations.
If you speak about naked, very interesting. You know the piece, the photo of Ai Weiwei naked with 5 women.
Yes.
And what is very interesting, if you speak about it to him, he is telling you what he is doing it very often. If people wanted to visit him, he invites them to come. When they want to have a photo, they say, we can do it naked, please.
Really? Does he? I didn't know that.
Yes, of course.
I guess the thing about those shots is they're kind of, one of the things that interests me is that when artists, I'm not sure if he would call those shots artworks or not. Obviously, he's appeared naked in the sculptures that were in Venice in 2013 or whatever. And certainly I am interested in the way artists designate things as art and other things as non-art. And in general, Ai Weiwei is fairly inclusive in what he describes as art because he sees his blogging and his activism as art. But I don't know if that means that he would identify that as his own artwork or not. When I heard about that very original picture of him with the 5 women, it was because he was participating in her political campaign because she was part of a sex worker campaign. And I can't remember the specifics, but
I know the photographer.
He tries to be supportive of his activist colleagues.
The photographer who took this photo, I know him well, and he told me what
Really?
was not the first and not the last time. But what I want to talk, I think it's very difficult to talk about Ai Weiwei because you have to know now in the moment he has 2 big shows in Bejing.
Yeah.
One in, 2 big galleries at the same time.
Yeah, because he's represented by 2 galleries there.
Galerie Continua and another one. And you have
Or
to
is
ima-
Mele,
yeah.
probably? Mele?
No,
I can't
no.
pronounce it.
And you have to imagine he can show his works now in 2 big galleries. At the same time, he's doing every day 3 or 4 interviews.
Yeah.
And so it's very different to understand it. And
Yeah.
for me, when I was the first time in Bejing, I realized I can understand the art pieces of Ai Weiwei and the others, but there is something what I cannot understand. And for me, one point is the idea of strategy of Ai Weiwei. We have to realize he's still alive. He can do everyday interviews. He can make his shows, but he cannot travel, but he can travel inside of China. It's possible. And it was a question for you, how it's possible for him to do all these things.
Well, yeah. I mean, the way it was put to me was really, he couldn't be incarcerated because of his fame through his father. Because his father is a kind of poet laureate of the country and is taught in middle school. Everybody studies his poems. And so, and also his father, although he'd been an enemy of the state for all of Ai Weiwei's youth, he had become rehabilitated after Mao died and had occupied official positions within China. And so, Ai Weiwei, I mean, he doesn't come from the princeling classes quite, but, there are myriad connections there which protect him like other Chinese activists are not protected. He also, has operated in a very, I think, clever strategic way in terms of not being incarcerated like some of his colleagues, well, for long periods of time anyway, because he doesn't come up with like a 10-point manifesto that really clearly outlines in a kind of like political way what the agenda should be and what's wrong with a government and things like that. He uses humor and visual illusion and things that are kind of harder, like a little bit more slippery. And that is one of the virtues of visual art, actually. One thing Wengeshi Mutu says, and it's a very short quote, so I won't be reading very much, is that she loves the way art can persuade people of things they don't already believe, because through visual means, you can kind of almost slip in around their political defenses. And so I think that is she's the one who articulates it, but I think it's something you can definitely find in the way Ai Weiwei operates. In the way Ai Weiwei operates. It sounds like you're very suspicious of him. No?
I'm speaking because we have written about him.
No. I probably have a soft spot for him. I encountered him, I encountered him before he went into prison. I was supposed to visit him in Beijing when he was in prison, so I ended up having tea with his wife, Lu Qing. I, tracked him through that whole period. I met him before and after. I don't know. I felt, I think too. I met him before he was on the front pages of all the newspapers, and that and felt very persuaded by him in the first instance, and then again persuaded by him during my final conversation with him, which is the final scene of Act 1.
No, I don't want to fix you on this subject. In your book, you are speaking about the diversity of subjectivity of the artist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can you speak a little bit about, for me the question is, in which way the subjectivity of Maurizio Catalan or of Jeff Koons or of Ai Weiwei or whatever is influenced by the cultural differences?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I repeatedly ask the question, what is an artist? And the thing that really comes home is that being an artist is not a job, it's an identity, it's a hard-won identity. Not everyone is an artist or can be an artist. It takes a remarkable amount of self-belief and persistence. Those are the things they all have in common. The other thing is that it's a highly customizable role, and the more highly it's customized in a way, the more likely that artist is to gain recognition. And so I already gave the example of an enemy of general sensibilities. I mean, you could say the quintessential American is Jeff Koons, because the metaphors he brings up often liken the artist to salesman, and which is kind of, he treads backwards into that metaphor several times. When Geshe Mutu describes herself as a tattletale, as the one who tells the family secrets. And I think often the metaphors that artists use come from the kind of knowledge production that they experienced in their native cultures or their family cultures. And so when Geshe Mutu comes from a tribe in Kenya which doesn't even have a word for artist, the closest term is the word magician, which is amazing, isn't it? You know, and then, but it's, you know, coming from that tribal culture, it's interesting that, like, the truth teller is the tattletale as opposed to, like, the scientist academic. Kutle Gadaman sees himself a bit more like a scholar in his work, and he works in documentary, and you can kind of see through the you know, the way he works and his interviewing of subjects is a bit more like a social scientist, let's say. Francis Elise, when I ask him what kind of artist is he says he's a midwife, just the guy who's on the side, which is a kind of, I felt like was a really refreshing change to, like, the old school kind of abstract expressionist ideology that, you know, virility and creativity were somehow, like, joined at the hip. He's a Belgian who lives in Mexico City, so I'm not certain how it relates to either, except it's a highly un-Mexican metaphor. I'd say it comes out much more of a European tradition. Cuauhtemoc Medina, who's in a curator who's in the room with him at the time, likens the midwife role to Socrates, because Socrates talked about how he was a midwife to ideas. But the Mexican art world is exceedingly macho, and I find it incredibly, I can't imagine a Roscoe ever referring to himself as a midwife, or any of the other artists I've interviewed there. Who else can I talk about? I mean, there's lots more artists in the book.
I have another question.
Yeah, okay.
It's better to speak without book.
Okay, I'm just looking at the table of contents to remind myself of some of the others.
The book is written in a way that everyone who is not inside of the art scene can read it. And for me, one question is, what you want to say to the lectors? To the reader of the book?
Right.
In which way it can help him to live his own life, if he's knowing more about in which way an artist is creating his own life.
Well, I mean, it's hard to speak of a single reader. I think different readers will glean different things from the book.
I think behind it, it's your own question, what is an artist? It's not the question coming from outside to you, it's your own question. And perhaps you can give me an answer, or try to give an answer, in which way it helps you as reader of your own book to create another life, if you know more about in which way an artist is creating something, in which different way he's living, in which way it helps.
Well, I can answer that in about 3 different ways. I mean, just the question I thought you were asking me at first. I think one reader I've always had in mind was the artist-student. Because, I know from my experience with 7 Days in the Art World that a lot of the contextual issues, a lot of the cultural, social, and economic dynamics going on around their work are nearly taboo in a lot of art schools. They're not discussed, and they are so much part of the reality of artists' everyday lives upon graduation that writing about it explicitly feels to me like a way of leveling the playing field so that it's not the artists with like automatic social skills who wins the game. In a way, it can be, just to give an example, like it is often the case that, not often the case, but various times I've talked to grad students just after graduation, and there's always the complaint that, in the MFA class, so-and-so got a dealer right away. Well, he was like really connected and really socially skilled. And then so-and-so, who everybody in the class thought was the best artist, is still like, working as an art handler. And partly because we're not all kind of equally adept at seeing what's going on, outside of our the stricter definition of the work. And so for me, this is a way of making it more democratic, opening up the field, allowing that artist for whom it's not instinctive and doesn't come naturally to learn about it through other means. And I think for me, I'm hugely interested in identity, and I think the identities that artists carve out are absolutely fascinating and kind of liberating. Other artists have much greater freedoms in the way they define themselves, define their work, define their rules, and it's an aspiration for even a writer who's got relative freedoms compared to someone who's working in a company or a larger institution. Does that make sense?
Of course. Now, one question is, how did you make the selection of the artists? You are speaking about Damien Hirst, you are speaking more than one time about Jeff Koons, you are speaking either way, some very important and very known artists, but on the other side you make choice of some artists we don't know very good. But how did you make the choice? Because you met, I don't know how many artists you met in China and United States and South America.
I interviewed 130 different artists for the book, and there are actually only 29 artists in the book. So I was spoiled for choice, and the selection was not easy. There are a lot of interesting artists who I would have liked to have included, but I just didn't have the space or the time. I had to finish the book at some point. And the few of the final cuts were kind of painful, and I hope to write about those artists in future. So let's say, so there was those 3, or even Marina Abramović, I put in the same camp with Ai Weiwei, Koons, and Hirst as those kind of artists who become benchmarks that other artists discuss. They become people who are relevant internally to other artists. Then there were artists who had explored what it meant to be an artist in their own work, sometimes through self-portraiture. So one of the recurring characters in the book is Andrea Fraser. She has made many artworks that interrogate myths of the artist and the role of the artist, and for me it was kind of absolutely essential that she be in the book. She's probably the artist I identify with more than any other. She says the things that I need someone to say. And she's a Bourdieu scholar. She happens to be exactly the same age as me. And, there's a sociological aspect to her interrogation of the role of the artist. So, and someone like Mauricio Catalan also has done a lot of self-portraiture and played with the role of the artist in explicit ways, and also delegated aspects of an artist's job to others. Of course, loads of artists have assistants, but not many artists actually employ somebody to give their artists talks and museum lectures and do their interviews for them, which is what Massimiliano Gioni did for Catalan. And it was a very clever move on Catalan's part, because Catalan is not very articulate. And here he hired Massimiliano Gioni, who's got a gift for the gab like nobody else. I mean, he is a really articulate guy in multiple languages. And so though there were artists who came in for those reasons, because they were kind of asking my question. And then I didn't decide on my 3 themes of politics, kinship, and craft until 3 years into the research. So I started researching the book in summer 2009, and in summer 2012, I sat down with piles of transcripts, and I thought, okay, what can this look like? Like, how can I create some kind of structure out of this? And I'd done 100 interviews. Well, actually, interviews with 100 artists, because I'd already multiply interviewed some people. And at that point, the themes came through, and they were really the themes that seemed to distinguish artists from non-artists. So are you an artist, or are you just a craftsman, or a designer? Artist or activist, artist or politician, artist, or are you just like a hobbyist wife, mother? Because that unfortunately is, and less so nowadays, but certainly was relevant to the older women artists I interviewed. And so those 3 themes came to the fore, and at that point then other artists kind of rose to be obvious to include. Someone like Grayson Perry, who's well-known in Britain and not very well-known outside, works in ceramics and embroidery and printmaking and deals with all of the crafts. And at that point, when I decided that craft would be the final act, and I interviewed Grayson for 7 Days in the Art World and then Not Really, and included him. And, at that point I thought, okay, Grayson makes sense to flesh out that side of things. And so that's how those were really my criteria. It was really about the themes of the book and the structure of the book.
What I realize, it's not only a topic, it also, but you create a kind of association. You let speak, you make a portrait of Mauricio Catalan, and another, if you speak about another artist, he's speaking about Catalan as someone who has another position. So you create association in order to connect the chapters together. And it was my feeling that you have made again interviews in order to make it possible.
Yes. Yeah.
I have the feeling during the writing, you realize in order to make a connection between them, I have to speak to this artist again in order to.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes I had the detail that would form the bridge between the 2 scenes, and other times. Well, in general, each scene is based on multiple interviews. So, Catalan has maybe 4 scenes, and I track him from summer 2009 until his retirement. He ceases to be an artist on the just before his Guggenheim solo retrospective opens. And actually, I see him again in the very final scene of Act 2 at the Venice Biennale. So maybe he's appears 5 times, but I probably interviewed him 20 times. So those quotes are accrued over, and in the summer of 2009, I interviewed him 4 times, but there's only 1 scene. So I just I chose to open one of the interviews I did with him, we went to see a show called Maurizio Catalana's Dead in Haarlem. And so for me, that just seemed like such a beautiful context to have the conversation. So, I'd interviewed him in his apartment, and I'd interviewed him in New Jersey. I'd actually done participant observation with him for 3 days in New Jersey while he was doing a photo shoot with W, which was kind of a precursor to toilet paper, his current project. I'd seen him in Venice, Milan, and Basel. I spent a whole day with him in Basel, actually, while he was shopping, because he's a collector as well, and just decided that the most salient kind of confrontation with himself and his work and his career was that particular journey we made up to Haarlem. And so it means that when you read through it, you think, God, his quotes are good. And that's because I really worked at getting them, But that did actually happen. We did, I just relocate some quotes into the scene.
Let us come back to the topic of globalization. When I was the first time in China making some interviews, I have a feeling if all these artists, great artists, would come to United States or Europe, it would be like a bomb. Because
a bump?
Like a bomb, because you cannot handle this kind of making art in the Western way. It means the art history, the Western art history, cannot understand what Ai Weiwei is doing or what other Chinese artists, for example, are doing.
I just immediately, I think Ai Weiwei's show at the Hirshhorn was very misunderstood because, art critics like Roberta Smith of the New York Times and Peter Schjeldahl of the New Yorker really, at the end of the day, espouse formalist positions where they think they can just look at the work and know nothing about Chinese culture and understand it. And you can't. You actually do need some backstory and some cultural understanding in order to interpret the work.
You met Karen Smith. She's based in Bejing. Karen Smith.
Yes.
She was born in London, but she's based in Bejing since around 20 years. And she has a knowledge about cultural differences and so on.
Yeah.
So, for example, Western way of looking on Ai Weiwei, when he did his piece in a castle, and the storm was coming and the tower was falling down, after it, he say, "This is my art piece." But nobody was thinking about why he can say, but this tower, the tower before, it was his art piece. But now the storm was coming and the art piece is destroyed. Why he can say, this is now my art piece? And if you think about it, you have to think, excuse me, would I speak like a teacher? You have to think about the time difference, understanding of time. The Chinese understanding of time belongs to the art pieces of Ai Weiwei, for example, or to other Chinese artists. This is something in which you are interested to understand more about.
Well, I know you're writing a book about time, so I think you should elaborate on that. Honestly, I do, because I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
No.
Because I mean, I don't have a particular.
No,
I'm actually not. I'm not aware of the tower you're talking about. I don't know what tower you're talking about.
the documenta piece.
The
The
fairy tale
with the doors.
with the.
The
Oh yeah,
tower
yeah,
out of
yeah.
the doors,
Okay,
yeah.
yes, I do know what you're talking about. Okay, I didn't know he'd said that though.
After the
Yeah,
storm
I mean,
everyone was sad about it. Now the art piece of Ai Weiwei is destroyed, and Ai Weiwei say, "No, it's not destroyed. This is my art piece now." And if you know more about the consciousness of time in the Chinese culture, you understand this is right. The time.
can you elaborate about the consciousness of time in Chinese culture? Because I'd love to know.
For example, Ai Weiwei is, I'm a little bit shy to speak now. No, for example, if you take Ai Weiwei as an example, when the tower was destroyed by the storm, he was saying, "This is my art piece now." And the idea behind is, Ai Weiwei is why he is still alive, why he's not in the prison. Not only because his father was very known, because the Chinese government would not say. For example, I have spoken to another artist and I asked him, "Can you help me in which way I can have a visa for 5 or 10 years?" He said, "You know Ai Weiwei, go to him. He can give you an invitation for 5 or 10 years."
So he could leave the country?
No, you have to, this is something what you don't realize in Germany or United States. Ai Weiwei is writing an invitation for a visa. You can stay 5 years. You can have a visa for 5 years. No,
in which country would he have a visa? I'm sorry, I'm not.
In China. If you,
okay.
For example, you can have a tourist visa, 3 months. You can have a visa for half a year. If you have a gallery who is writing an invitation letter, or perhaps you can have it for 1 year. But in order, because I like to go very often, so I would like to have a visa for 5 years. And I have spoken to some artists, and they say, "You know, Ai Weiwei, go to him, let you write an invitation letter, and you will have a visa for 5 years." So you cannot imagine it here. So you want to know more about time. For example, a difference of time understanding. If you want to make a revolution here, you have the aim, we want to change something. You don't think about what is possible now. Because this is the difference between a Chinese Ai Weiwei, who is thinking, what is possible now to say? What is dangerous for me to say? And he is handling in this way. This is a very Chinese way. Mm-hmm. I've spoken to him about it because he's speaking about himself like someone, no, Chinese culture, I'm living here, but he's a collector of Chinese old culture.
Yeah.
Furniture and so on. And when in between you can realize what he's real Chinese artist. His consciousness of time has to do with Chinese culture. Mm-hmm. And he's doing only something now, what is possible. You understand the difference? And someone who would like to change something, he would not think about what can I do now, what is not dangerous. But I'm not here to speak.
I mean, he has spoken to me about the Cultural Revolution and how it wiped out Chinese history, and partly his love of antiques is related to the nostalgia of a pre-cultural revolutionary time. So I'm not sure how that factors in. And I don't know which part of Chinese consciousness of time relates to like ancient philosophy and which part relates to 20th century communism and their relationship to history.
To Asian culture.
Yeah.
Good one. But my last question to now. If you met more than one artist in China and more than one artist in the United States, what is the difference between meeting artists in China, meeting artists in the United States?
Geez. I mean, there are so many differences. Like the attitudes to commerce, art. Different cultures have different attitudes to the degree to which commerce can interrupt an artist's credibility. So, and you could probably put like Beijing on one end and Berlin on the other, with Brooklyn in the middle, in terms of the way, and if an artist is seen to be profit motivated, it could be like just completely damaging to their perception in their local art world. And so, in Beijing, they're overtly commercial, and there's no problem really about it. Zheng Fanzi's studio is right next to his gallery. You know, they share a parking lot, which is really unheard of. Well, not unheard of, but not de rigueur here. You know, he's smoking cigars and, you know, proud to have a life similar to a collector's. And, you know, that is really not something that would be comfortable in Berlin. You know, generally artists hide their wealth and want to be seen to be making less than they do in Western culture. And perhaps it's most extreme in Berlin, and then in Brooklyn it'd be kind of or New York it'd be somewhere in the middle. That's one example, I guess.
I stop with my questions in order to give you the opportunity. Do you have questions?
Comments, complaints.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was a very interesting talk by the both of you. I was just wondering, you said that you were talking to so many artists, and you made it quite clear that you came quite close to at least some of them, I guess. I wonder whether you ever bother to ask them what they think about your book, because, I mean, I have to admit I haven't read it, but it sounds like you have some form of classification of the art into these 3 acts. Is that wrong?
I don't really classify or typify the artists. I just go with those 3 themes. Mm-hmm. So each act starts in summer 2009 and rolls through the present. So you've got 3 distinct timelines where that theme is the thing that holds the different, that theme holds the scenes together. But I don't believe in, you know, classifying artists by type, because at the moment they become a type, they're a stereotype, and they're not actually very credible. You know, they become a cliche, and then you think you don't believe in them.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But did you ever bother talking to them afterwards about this book?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, all the artists were, they read their own scenes, they were invited to read it in manuscript form, and they were all sent the book afterwards. I actually quote Orozco in the introduction because he read the whole book in manuscript form, and his comment was, we're all depicted in our underwear, but at least some of us get to keep our socks on. You know, I think that, you know, they're all presented as grounded human beings, and you know, hopefully no one is, you know, depicted as a saint or a complete sinner. You know, I have difficult relationships with some of the artists. You know, Damien Hirst kind of hated me and didn't want to see me because of an article I wrote on his art market in The Economist. But through various means, I end up getting an interview with him at the very end. He's a recurring character as well. With Katie Nolan, I don't know if you know her work, an American artist who's kind of has a cult status in New York, makes very Warholian work, but hasn't made anything since about 2001. With her, we fact-checked it with lawyers. And there was another artist who threatened to sue me, but she likes me now. She had, you know, read it when jet-lagged and probably when she'd had too much to drink. But, yeah, I mean, I feel like I should be on halfway decent terms with most of the artists in the book, but it doesn't mean they completely identify with the way I presented them. And I mean, I would say that's one of the problems with a lot of art writing is in order to get access, you usually have to trade off copy approval. So it means that the artists themselves or the artist dealer is your editor. And I never did that. And actually writing for The Economist gave me extra power not to do that because I couldn't do that. And so nobody had, I sent the chapters to them for fact-checking purposes, but no one had the power of censorship. And that's really important because, I'm sure there were, and actually there were definitely instances where artists felt like they could call in favor and, let's just cut that paragraph. And I dug in my heels. And I can give you an example if you like.
Okay.
Actually, in general, they were all very sensitive to issues of money. And I had to make sure I was extra factually accurate, when I was describing maybe like multiple homes or things like that. And Maurizio, interestingly, was like, that is just a shack. It's not a house. It's just a shack. Like strange things sometimes when you think of it, because when I write about Carol Dunham and Laurie Simmons, they're a painter-photographer couple. And they're very good friends with Roberta Smith and Jerry Saltz, who are powerful art critics in New York. And Carol Dunham said, he didn't strong-arm me in any way, but he was like, do you really need that in there? Is that essential? And given that part of the book is called Kinship, and I'm interested in artist support systems and sounding boards for their sense of self, it seemed absolutely integral to me. And so I kept it.
Sweet. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. I'm very pleased and I found it very, very interesting. The same, what I found interesting was when I read your first book, The 7 Days in the Art World, and because there's something which is really kind of seems to be impossible and maybe this is a very German point of view, but as we learn it at university and as we practice it and working in a museum, we do not, we speak about the works, but we do not speak about the person of the artist. And this comes, it comes to my mind to ask if this is maybe something which comes more from a British perspective, where the artists are much more also can be celebrities and they are reported in the press and they are described. I mean, this is absolutely not what you are doing. This is what I really found so good on your books. It's a little bit like this kind of gossip and approaching the artists and to look very close to them, but it then has another system and another thinking and another method of which could maybe also be sharper sometimes, but then you see, okay, these are all living human beings and you certainly have to be, is that something which which you have been confronted with, to be not so sharp as you would have wished, to be more critique maybe?
Well, I think, just going, it is a very strong convention in the art world that you only write about the work. And when I was researching 7 Days in the Art World, I met with lots of sneering, disdainful comments that I would write about the art world. And I would say it's one of the ways that artists and artworks can be mystified, actually, if you don't draw attention to all the other people, the curators and dealers and collectors that are going on behind the scenes. It may be even stronger in Germany than it is in Britain, but I'd say it's extremely strong in Britain. I think that the benefit of Germany is you have a much more intellectual press, and so than in Britain or America, and a much better educated audience about contemporary art, and you have Kunsthalles and Kunstvereins in every small town, right? Whereas
but maybe there's also another difference between Britain and Germany's, for example. This that I do not have this perspective on the class. I do not know if I'm speaking about an artist. I'm not aware if he's coming from upper class or working class. So this is not my point of perspective or my point of view. Maybe this is also really a difference between.
Well, I think the British are absolutely obsessed with class. And so I'm not surprised, actually. I mean, I've never made a study of German culture, but it strikes me from the outside as being a more kind of egalitarian, meritocratic culture. And I mean, I think that museums are major marketers of artist personalities and images. And I think that even happens in Germany. I mean, I was astonished when I went to the Museum Ludwig to see a picture of Andrea Fraser. She was like 30 feet high, you know? And it's very typically the case in various countries around the world. That, you know, there are street posters, like, you know, flags on the light posts for the exhibitions, advertisements in the subway system, big advertisements in the major newspapers.
But
so
in your book about
the
Cindy
block
Sherman in San Francisco.
exactly
for the show, yeah.
exactly. So like the museums have a role in building up artist brands. And often around the image of the artist, if they can. If you look at the percentage that will opt for the self-portrait over the, you know, or an image of the artist in some way, shape, or form in the studio, they do that a lot. And so it is their way of popularizing art.
That's true. At the museum, we are just preparing or taking over or working with Tate on that Agnes Martin show. Here's my colleague Maria Muller, who is a curator for that show, and there has been a long thinking and discussion about if on the poster and of the is Agnes Martin as a person, and they found now I think a very, very nice photograph of old Agnes Martin sitting on a chair.
In the studio, and you also see the painting. So.
Yes.
That's your alibi. Yeah, I could see that with Agnes Martin, that's a particularly difficult case, of course, because you need to experience it first person. Yeah.
So yeah, it's clear that museums are part of the system. This is true. But yeah, maybe there are other people from artists, or so maybe you want to add something or comment, or should we go upstairs and
have a drink?
Wine together, which is also nice, or go in the garden?
Sure, no question.
Yeah, then thank you very, very much. It's really
Thank you
interesting.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you so much, Norbert. Thank you.
Thank you too. Vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen und gute Heimreise.